Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Committee of the Whole meeting for February 6th. I'll call this meeting to order and acknowledge that the Northern Rockies Administration Center is located in the heart of the traditional territory of the Dene Cree and Dene Sa people of Fort Nelson and Prophet River First Nations. We further recognize the rights provided by our treaty and celebrate the contributions and the enduring presence of the Métis people in our region. Please be advised that tonight's meeting is available for the public to attend virtually and is being streamed and recorded. Any additions, Council? CAO?
No.
Okay. Are there any comments from the public? Seeing none. Just looking for a consensus around accepting of the agenda. Seeing good, everyone, thank you. So that takes us to new business, the 2026 asset renewal and reserve contribution presentation. And we have Colwyn Sunderland with us from Kerr, Leidel. I'm wondering if we can just do brief introductions around the room so that you know who's here. So I'll start with me, Lorraine Gerwing.
Councillor John Roper, Northern Rockies.
Councillor Danny Souls, Northern Rockies.
Hi, Colin. Scott.
Hi, Colin. Aaron.
Alicia, Communications.
Stacy, Deputy Corporate Manager. Tony. Councillor Brenda Enox, Northern Rockies.
Okay, and also in the room is Jasmine and Josh, which I'm sure that you know well, and my two grandkids that have promised me they are going to be on their best behavior. So if they're not, we can all turn around and shoot daggers. Okay, thank you. All right, so welcome. Yeah, take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. So I'll just do a bit of an intro and a bit of a primer before I hand it over to Colwyn. Purpose of today's meeting is to discuss the recommended increases to the reserve accounts, and it has been part of the sustainable service delivery process that we've been working on. This today is specific to the assets, the infrastructure assets and the renewal program that's been in place since 2014. The intent to do today is to have the discussion with council prior to budgets, because we actually have some recommended increases to that renewal program that is part of the budget process. And we want to provide the information today for information and discussion with council, not looking for any decisions today, of course, in the committee of the whole meeting. It's more around for information and to have a discussion and answer any questions you may have. The asset renewal program was rolled out in 2014. As part of our requirement of the IDCA agreement. Of course, we have a very robust asset program, asset management program. And since then, the contributions annually have been generally static. So somewhere in the neighborhood of about $8.9 million annually, which is a contribution to the reserve fund, which the various funds for water, roads, sewer, buildings, etc., mobile equipment. With the exception of the mobile equipment, 50% of those contributions are looked after by the province, right? It's part of that program that we've negotiated with the province. Originally, as you're aware, the IDCA program, we were supposed to use it or lose it annually, but because we were required to have an asset management program, we said, well, in order to do that, you need to smooth out your costs over time. And we were able to use the program to contribute to our renewal program. So as I said, the funds have been typically static. Colwyn, we'll get into some detail into the PowerPoint when we do the presentation. So there'll be some duplication, but generally, we've been able to maintain the program with $2014 essentially. For a number of reasons, but the two bigger reasons. One is interest earned on our funds that we have in the program goes back into the program. So it helps stretch those funds out. And then additionally, even though we do modeling to say when certain particular pieces of infrastructure will be replaced, we don't replace it because the model says so, we replace it because it needs to be replaced. So and for instance, on the road side, even though the roads program has gone up way higher in terms of from compared to inflationary rates, we've deferred projects through the years because when we reassess the roads or reassess certain infrastructure, the deterioration hasn't gone at a rate that the model has projected. So we have been able to defer certain projects as a result, which keeps the money in the bank, keeps the interest rolling in, and is able to maintain the existing levels that we've had since 2014. We're at a point now where we need to discuss increases that contribution. We did a presentation in 2024 that, similar to today, that outlined what potentially was upcoming as a bit of a primer for council at the time. And there's a slide, and you'll see a slide there today too, on today's presentation, that's, is status quo an option, and it isn't from a service level perspective. You'll see that if we don't increase our contributions, the line goes underwater. And we're starting to see, and that's generally for all the funds combined. We're in a situation right now where some of our we'll call it our buckets, we call it, for reserve accounts, are starting to get close to being depleted, just because obviously depending on the projects for a certain year. We might, like, for instance, we look at 44th Street, for example, from a water or sewer and a roads perspective, was an extremely expensive project. It took a big dent out of the roads program and out of the sewer program. All that said, financially, we're in good shape. You'll probably be hard pressed to find an organization that hasn't had to go to debenture to either replace infrastructure, or look after major projects, or to invest in capital. And we haven't borrowed a penny, with the exception of what we have owing in debenture for the rec center and previous way back with the water system. Where that helps us is we're not paying interest rates on borrowed money, and we're actually making interest on the money that we have in the bank. So in terms of that case, as an organization and as a community, we're in really good shape, because financially we don't have any real debt. That said, increases are required. The timing is actually reasonable right now, because if you recall, last year we actually got an increase for our IDCA program, funding wise. So we bumped from our 5 million from the province annually to about 6.6 million. So roughly 1.69 million dollars in additional funding from the province. We need to match that funding as part of our commitment. We don't necessarily have to match it annually, but over the term of the agreement, we're required to have equal or more funds contributed to the program than what the province provides. We can't have less. So essentially, with the increase last year of 1.6 million, it bumps up our contribution about 1.6 million. And when we do the math, we're in at $3.5 million range, $3.5 million range in terms of and you'll see in the presentation, that's approximately the increase required to the program, with the exception of the mobile equipment, because mobile is not covered under our IDCA program. So the increases that we recommend to the program are essentially 50-cent dollars because of the IDCA program. And we'll show on the graph how that impacts future years, and how it continues to maintain the infrastructure so we can continue to provide sustainable services for the community. I'll hand it over to Colwyn here. The PowerPoint's fairly short, on purpose, so we don't, it's more of a visual and lots of dialogue, and feel free throughout the presentation to ask questions if you need to ask questions at a certain point. The team that was involved in putting all this together was, of course, Tony, myself, Josh, and Jasmine and their team. And with the help with K2L, which we have Colwyn on the screen and Alejandra. And in the background, our old Director of Public Works, Luann, was part of it. She's online right now too. She's been part of that program because Extreme brings a ton of knowledge and historical knowledge that was beneficial as we built this. Because a lot of work goes into this to flush out the data to determine from an asset renewal perspective what's required at what time and what the costs are. So unless you have any questions or anything, I'll could hand it over to Colwyn.
Okay, we'll just take a second and hi, Kyle. Are there any questions?
None for me.
Before we-
Hi, everyone.
Okay, and who else is online? Sorry.
That would be Alejandra with K2L
Oh, okay.
and
Okay, good. Councillor Roper.
Just a point of clarification, the purchase of the new fire hall that came out of this particular account or these accounts were.
At a buildings and facilities, yes. Yes, yeah, you bet. And what happens there? It's a good question because what we we can get into this in more detail during the budget time. But what we've been also looking at, we've been doing is typically the renewal because it's renewing existing infrastructure. But what is comes out of those accounts, but even the upfront capital costs, we can pull out of those funds, but it just recalculates what the contribution would be because typically I'll use a round number. If you use $10,000 over 10 years, and that's what your replacement is, it's $1,000 a year to replace it. If you purchase it and it's a new asset, then you have to capital outlay at 10,000 and then 10,000 replacement. So then your total value then is 20, 10 for the initial purchase, 10 for replacement. So it helps smooth out those capital costs also, which in this year's budget, when we review the budget, there's a couple of phased capital pieces of equipment for the water system that we actually smooth out with the water. So we smooth out those costs over, say, 25 years or 30 years. Right? So.
Go ahead.
Would the purchase of that building have a direct correlation with the need to increase our funding to the account and the increase from the province?
Not necessarily per se, because there was two components that were constantly discussed as part of the buildings and facilities plan was investment into town hall or replacement of town hall and investment in the public works fire hall building. So that's always been on the books to the point where the province actually tapped us on the shoulder a couple of years ago and said, you got an awful lot of money in your buildings and reserve facilities. You're not taking a whole lot out. What's going on? And we said, let's go back to our conversations we had a number of years ago. We want to make sure we do it right and we have our due diligence done. So not necessarily. The big ticket item you'll see on one of the graphs here from a buildings and facilities piece is the rec center. Is when you get into that 2050, 2060, 2070, so a number of years down the road, you start seeing spikes. And not that we have to put a pile into that buildings and facilities plan today, but as things start to need to be replaced at the rec center, when you look at $100 million facility, it really makes a dent into the cost. But in terms of those decisions made, it's not a direct correlation because it was part of the plan at the very outset. Okay.
Great, thanks.
Good.
Yep.
Good.
Colwyn.
Are we good to go here?
Yep.
Yeah, you hear me. Okay, great. First of all, thank you for the opportunity, the privilege of making this presentation. I had the good fortune of working with Northern Rockies and Scott and the senior leadership team, Northern Rockies, for the last dozen years or more on asset management. I also wanted to mention that I should acknowledge that I served as your appointed representative along with Scott on the IDCA management committee. And I did also want to just acknowledge Alejandra Taylor, who's joined us, just in case there are any tough technical questions, because Alejandra has been instrumental in assembling the data behind this presentation. So I'll get into it. First of all, and I should say, Scott, please do, if you see a hand up or somebody indicating a question there, you're very, very small on my screen, so don't hesitate to budge in and let me know if there's a question. So I think, Scott, you've covered probably what's in this slide very well. The intent of the discussion to sort of build on a presentation that we made in July of 2024 to this council, talking about sustainable service delivery and sort of some of the migration of thinking on asset management, and how it's sort of taking shape around the sort of primary focus of sustainable and resilient delivery of your core infrastructure services. Discussions of the implications on the IDCA funding, which I think Scott has introduced very nicely. And discussion of asset renewal reserve contribution levels, which is where we want to sort of land in terms of spending some time on discussion toward the end of this presentation. This was a graphic that we had developed and shared with council for discussion in July of 2024. And really the intent of this is to sort of shift a little bit the way that we visualize the overall work of asset management around this theme of sustainable and resilient service delivery. This is definitely a direction that asset management practice has been taking across BC. And probably with NRM providing a real leadership position in a lot of respects in BC's asset management community. I want to acknowledge that. The principles here are that staff and council work together collaboratively to support the needs of the community for delivery of services, and recognize that there's dialogue or discourse back and forth between the community and the organization represented by council and staff in what the expected levels of service are, for example. Acknowledging that there's always a discussion around the cost of service, and that's a public process as well with your budget process. And providing input and feedback on service delivery from time to time through things like it may be an OCP update or another public process. And that in the relationship that council and staff have on service delivery, some kind of really key themes along with the development and approval of that annual budget are effectively managing risks, understanding what those service levels should be. So what are the targets? And doing the strategic planning, the work of looking ahead and developing a deliberate plan that ensures that those services can be and will be delivered sustainably and in a resilient way. Another sort of a circular diagram here, which is not a coincidence, the Asset Management BC Sustainable Service Delivery Framework. This is a concept that's been sort of well socialized province-wide around what asset management is. So we consider it to be sort of a plan, do, check, act type of cycle, acknowledging that we have phases of planning and implementation in the way that we manage infrastructure, which is really an important principle. And that infrastructure management involves a number of different domains of management practice, including people, information, the assets or infrastructure itself, and finances. And all of those need to be kind of managed and kept in balance. The ultimate object of the game is to maintain stable levels of service over time, manage risks effectively, and manage at what we like to call the lowest sustainable cost, or the lowest life cycle cost of delivering those necessary levels of service. And that's really the name of the game. Another way of looking at it, it's a balancing act, trying to ensure that we're able to sustain those expected levels of service, recognizing that sometimes weighing on the other side of that balance are risks, costs, and time is a really important factor. And we need to understand that time factor in managing assets over their life cycle. The full life cycle of an asset, and of course the costs of managing an asset over that full life cycle, include planning and design stages before an asset enters service, procurement, operation, and renewal. And so that's sort of an asset perspective on that life cycle. And then, of course, you've also got, as indicated on the Asset Management BC Sustainable Service Delivery Framework, sort of a planning and management life cycle that happens on a sort of a shorter time frame, usually about a 5-year planning cycle. When we consider the life cycle of any asset, you might consider this in the context of a road or a community building. An asset when it's first acquired or built or developed it will be in excellent condition, and it will have a very sort of its highest level of service. What happens during the entire life cycle of that asset is that there's some deterioration in the condition of the asset, and maybe in the case of something complex like a building, of components of that asset. And what's necessary there, and these are a lot of the things that sort of you find that staff is doing behind the scenes, considering sort of what is needed in terms of effective planning for ongoing and routine maintenance. From time to time, more major maintenance of those facilities, particularly something like a building. And then if it's a building or maybe a road, you'll have a rehabilitation phase that happens, or process that happens partway through, often around midlife of an asset. It might be a major renovation of a building which has sort of been in service for a number of decades. It may be an overlay on a road, so repaving a road, if I can put it that way. Whereas, sometimes at some point in its life, the entire structure of a road will need to be rebuilt, or the entire building will need to be replaced. And that's sort of at the end of a life cycle. Other things that sort of contribute external pressure on the level of service that's provided by an asset, and maybe in some cases its condition, would include climate change, or growth in demand. Excuse me. And so we have to manage all of these different factors over the life cycle of an asset. Since last July, when we were last with you for a discussion on asset management, there's been ongoing work, and want to emphasize that this is a sort of continual work on improving, developing, and updating information about Northern Rockies assets, and updates to plans for those assets. So we look at this in terms of master plans and asset management plans that usually focus on a particular service area or focus on a particular class of asset. We've done a significant amount of work with senior staff on understanding and defining levels of service across all of NRM services, and understanding and relating those to the cost of service, who benefits from a service, who's paying for those costs when we consider the sort of the budget and where the pieces of the budget come from, to have a better understanding of that relationship around the sort of sustainability of service delivery for each individual service and the cost of service. Funding levels, as Scott had mentioned, under the IDCA have been adjusted sort of for the third 5-year period in the 20-year span of the IDCA. So we're now sort of entering the second half of the lifespan of that agreement before it would be subject to renegotiation. And that represents about a $1.6 million increase in the funding from the province. Asset renewal long-term forecasts have been updated to reflect a better understanding, in particular, of the current state of buildings and facilities, and that's work that happened in 2025, but also across other asset categories, and so probably a more routine basis, including things like roads and drainage facilities. Asset renewal costs have been updated, as cost estimates have been updated to suit that. We'll get into the details of that very briefly here. Some key issues that we need to sort of be mindful of when we're thinking about cost of service, that we're talking about full life cycle costs of delivering services. So this very much looks at the sort of the tougher part of that nut to crack, which is the asset renewal cost, as Scott had mentioned in his introduction. But we can't forget that the full cost of service also includes the ongoing costs of operation and maintenance and delivery of programs that rely on infrastructure. And those are the operating costs that you would see in the annual budget. Changing conditions since the asset renewal funding levels for NRM's assets have been established. So I know that some of the asset renewal reserve contribution levels were established about a decade ago for some of the kind of core infrastructure categories. And there is a need to periodically update those, and that's really, the sort of the main focus and intent of today's discussion. Those funding decisions need to be driven by service, and we'll certainly be able to speak to a couple of examples of that as we get into the details. So a first look at the numbers. This has been updated significantly since July of 2024, when I think you last saw a similar graph. The grand total, the estimate that's sort of in the middle of this hasn't actually changed significantly since then. The primary changes, I would say, are that the facilities piece of the pie has actually become a little bit smaller, and that's really just a matter of having taken a closer look and being able to provide some updates in the details of the facilities inventory. We've taken a careful look through that and a sort of careful look at an understanding of the state of infrastructure, and that's resulted in an ability to actually reduce that number a little bit. And then the roads component, I would say, has increased quite significantly, primarily as a result of similarly keeping up with the unit costs of road maintenance and renewal activities, which have certainly increased quite a lot in the last number of years. One other thing that I should say about this is that this chart, so that $1.2 billion in the middle of the chart, represents an estimate of the total replacement value of all of Northern Rockies infrastructure assets. This is going to be a significantly different number than what you would see if you were looking at the accounting for tangible assets in your financial statements, which represents a depreciated net book value. So it's kind of a reduction from the cost of acquiring the asset when the asset was acquired sometime in the past. This is more of a look forward at what we would expect to need to fund in terms of asset renewals in the future. And so it's a considerably larger number because we're not depreciating it. We're actually looking at this as what would it cost if, for example, we had to replace all of Northern Rockies infrastructure assets all at once today. We know that we don't have to replace all of the infrastructure assets today, but we will have to replace them sometime in the future. And this rather colorful chart is essentially a forecast of the timing of the need to renew NRM's infrastructure assets over the next full century. So this is a very long-term forecast. I should say it is not nearly as precise as the numbers and colors on the graph would suggest that it is. When we forecast out anything more than a few years in the future, we deal with quite a lot of uncertainty. And I think it's really important to recognize that there's uncertainty in the replacement cost estimates, and there's a great deal more uncertainty in answering the question of how long an asset will last before it needs to be replaced. But it is important for us to estimate these things because it's this estimate that enables us to understand sort of that long-term financial plan, that long-term view of how much money would be needed at what time to replace assets. And that's the basis for the estimation of those reserve contribution levels for renewing assets. Maybe I'll just quickly pause before I move to the next slide. Are there any questions anybody has on anything I've presented so far here?
Yeah, Councillor Andrews does.
Go ahead.
Hey, go ahead, Councillor Andrews.
Thank you. I was just curious, what's driving the spikes on the airfield side? I think that's what those ones on the 2030, 2040.
Yes, it certainly is, and that's a good question. Now, one thing I'll say before I get into the answer to that is that some of those spikes will be funded through the ACAP program, so they're funded by the federal government. The largest ones generally would be. And so when we talk about the airfield, we're essentially talking about, if you imagine the airport, the fence line and everything within the fence line. Those are assets which are sort of specific to that purpose of operating an airport. Other assets, primarily the ones that are on the outside of the fence line, are included in other categories, including buildings and facilities, roads, water, sewer, and drainage. So the airfield assets, the big spikes are essentially projects to renew pavement. And so the biggest of the spikes overall are going to be replacement activities or renewal activities for the main runway 0422. But the taxiways and aprons and the crosswind runway 0826 are also in this forecast, which is a point of probably discussion, maybe not for this meeting, but for potentially a subsequent meeting when you take a closer look at the airport and opportunities for optimizing life cycle costs and levels of service for the airport. Did that get to your question?
It did. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right, I jump to the next.
Oh,
Sorry, go
just a
ahead.
second. Councillor Souls has a question.
Yeah, I just had a question. Like I have been really interested in asset management ever since we started it quite a long time ago. And the unknowns of asset management, I'll illustrate it this way. I think like the BC Parliament building is a beautiful example of something that was built a very, very, very long time ago. I doubt it has any debt related to it. And I always wonder how an asset like that is managed under an asset management program when it's 100 and some odd years old, and who knows nobody knows the people and we know who the people were who built it, but they're all long gone and so on. And I think that it kind of illustrates the quest that we're on when you try to figure out how to plan for the future. And so one of the questions I had regarding this is more along the political side. I know that Colwyn, I've talked to you a number of times at asset management events and so on, and I think of how the province and us are in a partnership in this IDCA agreement, and that by itself, that's one segment of this asset management plan for not for mobile equipment, but for the static things. And I'm wondering, is there provincial policy now that asset management is growing to be a central sort of a mechanism in the province? Are there political policies that are partially driving the increase in cost that directly affect us, provincial policy driven?
I'll do my best to answer that question. Of course, I can't answer on behalf of the province, but I think in terms of the direction that we hear from staff at the Ministry of Housing and Municipal Affairs on sort of the policy direction around asset management, there is certainly an increased emphasis on local governments having good plans for their infrastructure, long-term plans for their infrastructure, and considering these questions of full life cycle cost, long-term financial planning. The province's approach on this generally, I would say, is more an emphasis on sort of education and outreach and communication on what the needs are than requiring things in policy or regulation. And that's a significant difference, for example, between BC's approach and Ontario's approach. In Ontario, there are regulations that require local governments to have asset management plans. When those requirements came into force, the province issued, they rolled out a grant program that had a relatively very small amount of funding to create an asset management plan. And what happened, I think, was that communities created something that kind of walks and talks and looks like an asset management plan, but wasn't really built on very good information. And so they didn't really have a well-calibrated look into the future and what their needs were. Whereas in BC, I think we've taken our time to sort of learn a lot of these things over the last 20 years. And I will say that partly perhaps motivated by the IDCA, Northern Rockies was one of the earliest municipalities in the province to create and share publicly a 20-year forecast of its infrastructure plans and needs. And that's the direction that the province of BC, as I understand it, is going from a policy perspective, that sooner or later there will be an expectation that municipalities and regional districts have a long-term financial plan and are operating under that long-term financial plan. I hope that addressed your question.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okay.
Yep. Seeing no further questions around the table, please proceed.
Okay, thank you, Chair Gerwin. We'll move along. So if we take that forecast of asset renewal needs by year for the next 100 years and compare that with the current level of asset renewal reserve funding. So if we add up all of the asset renewal reserve contributions that are in the 2025 budget, about $8.55 million. At that level of funding, the good news here, and I think Scott had spoken to some of this, which is really important, is that the cost of all asset renewals that we can foresee over the next roughly 25 years are covered by the reserve funds that are currently held by Northern Rockies, as well as the contributions at that level. But what happens after the first 25 years is that we see sort of those reserve funds being depleted. And of course, this is, I should say, this is not an accurate accounting of, the time value of money. We haven't included or incorporated inflation or interest rates in this, earned interest on the savings. So that would help with extending that time frame that the reserves are in the black. But once they go into the red, of course, with interest, you very, very quickly accumulate a big drag on that red line, which is sort of trending downward after about 2050.
Could I just get clarification on something I think I heard you say?
By all means.
Is that this forecast does not include the interest that will be accumulated?
That's correct. This is quite a simplistic analysis, and the purpose of it really is just to look at, whether or not the reserve contributions are able to keep up with the long-term renewal needs for assets. So this is more of a dashboard than it is a forecast. And it really is to illustrate that concept. It's not a realistic look at what we expect Northern Rockies' financial situation to be 25, 30 years in the future. And the main reason for that is that we really can't predict that with enough precision to show anything much better than this graph, even if we did account for interest and inflation, because there's so much uncertainty in the rates of interest and inflation.
Just a second. Go ahead. Thank you.
Do something else?
No, you wanted to go.
Sure. So I can add to that. I mean, the reality is that, as Colwyn said, is when you look at that forecasting, you don't know what those funds are going to look like from an interest perspective. So, I mean, you can build in certain assumptions, but the farther out you go, the less you can predict, because there's so many variables that change that, right? So the reality is that the interest earned is going to go back in that account. So the actuals will determine that. But also, the less that's in the account, the less interest you're going to earn. So over time, as that account gets depleted, you're going to get less. You're going to accumulate less interest. You'll see farther ahead here that when you look at what the potentially the required value that we need to put into those reserve accounts versus what we recommend, there's a difference. That they're actually, what we recommend is lower than what the modeling suggests, because there's another, as I said earlier, there's a number of factors that potentially influence that. So it's the continued reassessment, right? What we can say with some level of certainty is that if we don't increase the contributions, then we will be underwater sooner than later, right? And it's not, I mean, unless council makes decisions to reduce those service levels, meaning, roads are worse condition, accepting potential failure on water lines or whatever it might be. It's either pay now or pay later. And the more you defer those costs, the more you're going to pay at the time, right? And what we're recommending right now is a bit of a phased approach in terms of what those increases are. And you'll see that at the budget time is that we're actually this year, not to get into too much into the budget process this year, but we're actually helping offset what the recommended increase is by utilizing what we're booking for, potentially projecting that we're going to get an interest this year to help offset that increase this year. So it's a stepped approach to get to it. So this is more of a visual to suggest that if we just maintain the existing contributions, this is what it looks like. And as I said earlier too, when you look at where it crosses a line in the graph, that's when all of those funds are basically, when we're at zero as a whole. If you were to break each individual one up, we will start depleting certain funding levels in certain areas earlier than that, of course, because some are healthier than others based on the program, right?
So I guess my struggle is that, like, the whole concept here is looking at future costs. So when you say that we can't predict what the interest rates are going to be, I would take that a step further to say that we can't predict what the costs are going to be either. Like,
Nope.
So for the way my brain is working, I would like to see something that has an estimated, like, what does this look like if the interest rate on whatever, however many millions of dollars that we have, what would that look like if the interest rate was at 2% or 3%? I just think that for the way my brain works is missing.
We can do that, but where I will respectfully challenge that is the other components. We don't know where inflation is going to be. So we're actually like, there's so many variables that influence it. That's why the continual reassessment. This is a snapshot in time, and we can spin it whichever way council wishes.
Yeah,
It
for sure.
doesn't change the number that we present and recommend to council, quite frankly. Like, at the end of the day, the number's the number. There's a lot of work that's occurred back in the background from a financial perspective that determines this is what the recommendation is. And it's literally based on information that we have today, our best projection, which could change 5 years from now. Right? That's the thing, right? And what we can tell you with certainty is that the intent of the slide is that if we do not increase it, it's not sustainable. And if we increase it to the value that we recommend, you'll see in the next slide, it moves it from about 2050 to 2070. That's 40 something years away.
Can you just pause for a second? The mayor is trying to get in.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I understand, when in terms of the interest earned, but that's a projection. The inflation is a projection, and the cost of goods is a projection. All that can go up or down and influence the outcome. So that's why it's important, and we continually reassess the program so that we can reevaluate. And that's why, you'll ask the question in a couple of slides probably to say, why is the value at this amount that we need based on a number and a modeling to maintain the program, but you're recommending less? Well, we're recommending less because we're factoring in the potential interest component. We're factoring in the possible deferral of certain projects because we may, Sunset Drive is a good example. We had Sunset Drive in the system. The modeling suggested to replace, I think it was 2019, just to pull a number out, and it was deferred 4 or 5 years. So the funds sat in the bank. We didn't have to do it because the system was reassessed. But when we sat here in 2014 and presented the program to you, we said Sunset Drive was getting replaced in 2014 or 2019, sorry, right? As an example. So again, this is a snapshot in time of what we project, but there's so many things that influence it, right? It's so what we can say with certainty is we need to contribute more to maintain. And it might go up from there 5 years from now, where we say today, or it could be down. But that's the reason why we're taking a very, I'll say, conservative look. So we're not doing the council saying, let's shoot for the stars here, because we don't want to over contribute. But our role as staff is not to under contribute, because unless council gives us direction to, right?
Okay, Councillor Souls, I see you, and no, just a second, and then Councillor Wolper, but I just want to check in with the mayor. Did you have anything that you wanted to add, Mayor, at this point?
No, I've been following along for quite a while, so I'm pretty good so far. Thanks.
Okay, all right, Councillor Souls.
I really recommend that we have this kind of a discussion at least once in every council term. bring it into a 4-year cycle to match I mean, as far as having the discussion around where we project where we're at, just so that every council can tap into that or contribute to that over the course of time. Just with that in mind, though, when I start looking at timelines, I mean, it takes a moment to look up what the dollar value of a 2014 dollar is today. And if you do that and apply that to our 8.55 million, we've got just current dollars equal to 2014 dollars to match would be about $12 million instead of 8.55. So even
But
like,
then we have the interest.
yeah,
that-
interest is also a variable in that, but
Yeah.
even the dollar value overall, whether you're going to call it inflation or you're going to call it something else, it really is affecting this directly. And if we keep an absolute static contribution without actually taking that into account over years and years, we're going to run out of funding out of our reserves.
And you'll see when we go into the budget process that we're actually projecting less interest on our money this year than actually what our actuals were for last year, because interest rates have went down.
Yeah.
Right. So that directly impacts. So but we didn't expect, quite frankly, to see the interest rates that we've seen the previous years compared to where we are, compared to what traditional or historical data was. Right. So, and that's why that reassessment is so important. Right. This is not something that we're going to come back 10 years or 15 years or 20 years from now. Like, this is a continual evaluation of, as staff, our role is to balance what we need to maintain, what our commitment is to the province. So if we look at that, all of the IDCA funds do not just go into reserve accounts, because there's special projects, because we look at trying to carve out as much as we can in terms of our outside our operations, because we can't use anything for operations. We try to carve as much as we can to demonstrate our contribution, so we can make sure we've got that weighting. And I don't want to use the word creative, but we've been very good at having conversations with the province to support projects that, if you look on the surface at the agreement back in 2012, when it was being discussed with the province, it wouldn't have passed the sniff test. But each year, when we provide 2 reports to council, one that projects the following year and one that outlines the previous year spend and activities, they get approved by the management committee and then supported by the Treasury Board. And all that there is in the balance of everything. So there's a ton of moving parts. And yes, this is a very simplified graph.
Mhm.
It's there just as a demonstration to say, it doesn't mean that on a certain date in 2050, but it just demonstrates that if you continue status quo and the current contributions, you'll be under.
Okay.
Interest could push it. Interest might pull it back. Cost could go one way. There's a bunch of factors that do it. And that's why when you look at that previous one that shows the cycle, that reassessment and reevaluation of the program is so important.
Okay. Councillor Wolper and then the mayor.
I think in my experience, this is a pretty good projection. I'm comfortable with it. I think the bottom line is that once we get so low in that account, interest isn't going to matter, because there's no interest on $0 if we get to that point. So I think it is important that we maintain this at a level where we are guaranteed that interest. We'll never know exactly how much it is, but I think this is a good representation of.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mayor.
Thank you. Yeah. So it's, it just makes sense that we don't bind the hands of future councils by running them out of money, by not putting enough in now to help them in the future. But I do have a couple of questions, and it's really about the contributions to the funds, to the accounts where you're not allowed to take any money out of it. So if you put it in sewer, you have to leave it in sewer. But is that also the case if you're just putting it in there from IDCA or from surplus, or is it only the funds that you put into the account, let's say sewer, that you've collected for sewer? And where I'm going with that is if, do future councils have the ability to access those funds for something other than sewer, because they were putting funds in that weren't collected for sewer? Are you following me?
Absolutely. And if I could respond to that, the reserve fund accounts that are established by council are discretionary funds. So today we may determine that the funds that we've put away for one purpose are not as required as they are for another purpose. So we do have opportunities to make those changes. We also have the opportunities to know that perhaps the funds that we have sitting in one reserve account today aren't needed for a number of years out. And we have the opportunity to borrow internally for other reserve accounts or other projects and service areas that don't have enough funds put away into those reserve accounts.
But that has to be replaced.
It has to be replaced, and essentially what happens is we borrow from ourselves and we must pay ourselves a reasonable interest rate to do it. So there's a cost to one reserve that gets offset in the repayment to the second reserve
And
that's borrowed from.
And just a point of clarification, and that is for all the reserve funds. So we
We-
said discretionary, so.
Yeah, so we do have a reserve fund for land sales. That's a statutory reserve fund. And that will all be covered in a report that we have in the budget binder this year. Then the other reserve funds that we have are discretionary reserve funds. The community charter allows councils to establish reserve funds for specific purposes, identifying how the money goes in and identifying what constitutes removing those funds.
So Mayor, I have a follow-up.
Go ahead.
But- Thank you. So, if this process that you're using takes into account that you're trying to ensure you have enough replacement funds whenever the service needs replacing or whatever the facility is. Now, it takes into consideration that we're funding the entire renewal cost. What happens if we're lucky enough that the federal government, the provincial government come up with 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 program, where a significant, maybe up to 66% of a particular project is paid by the province or the feds. So at that point, are you able to shift funds out of those accounts because obviously somebody else paid for them? Or does it just extend this line out further because you have to leave it there?
You essentially, Mayor, can do both, or you can reduce the contribution in following years to help offset that contribution that wasn't originally projected. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because so then basically the council of the day has the ability to maybe slow down on whatever it is that they want to put into those accounts.
Absolutely. And that's why I continue to stress the importance of the reevaluation, the reassessment of the program, because that's another factor. We've seen that happen. That's occurred. I mean, I think to Councillor Sol's point, when you do the math and look at what the 2014 dollars were and the program and the fact that today is 2026 and it's the first time that we're increasing the contributions to those reserves, all of that plays a piece. If we look at the water line that went out to the airport, that was grant funded. The upgrades at the water treatment plant, a lot of that was grant funded. The installation or improvements of the reservoirs at the golf course and out at the airport, that was grant funding, and that's all taken into account, which helps again balance those numbers, right? And that's why there's an ebb and flow. We haven't seen the same, especially with the sewer outfall, Councillor Goering's or Deputy Mayor Goering's favorite project. We didn't see the same. We tried, but we were
You didn't go to
successful.
jail.
I didn't go to jail. That was a good start, but we didn't have the same success when it came to grant opportunities.
Right.
And as such, you know, if we're to look at the various balances between funds, the sewer is low. Water is higher because the DAF program at the treatment plant. I mean, when we looked at this in 2014, there was plans to increase the capacity of the water treatment plant, but that plan was to build an additional space and additional trains. The DAF program, the dissolved air flotation system that we put at the water treatment plant increased capacity within for a fraction of the cost. So it actually, we didn't take as much out of water as we thought. But that just changes what that contribution need is today. It's not as high as it would most likely be if we actually had to build a piece on the water treatment plant as an example. So all that's part of that ebb and flow in terms of how you reevaluate and how you determine what those costs are.
Okay.
Good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Seeing no further questions around the table, please proceed.
Okay, thank you. So this next chart is a comparison of the current funding level with what we estimate the average need to be for sort of the next 25 years. And acknowledging that, just as been discussed here, this is something that needs to be reevaluated every few years. So there's kind of a note to that effect on the second column. But recognizing that some of those in some of those particular asset categories, we are seeing significant upward pressure on costs relative to what the estimates were in 2014. In some other cases, we simply didn't have a fund for some of these categories because we hadn't assessed what the need was in 2014. That was early in the asset management program. Some of those have been added since then. So the 8.55 million is actually more than what was established originally in 2014. But some of those categories that were established that long ago, for example, roads, we had an estimate of about 2.2 million as a renewal need in 2014, and the current estimate is 3.5 million. That's significantly increased, and that's in that sort of rough proportion to inflation, just as Councillor Souls had done that math on sort of what the inflation impacts have been on costs of construction. And other categories, we see similar increases. Water. I think sanitary sewer is actually lower. And one of the reasons that sanitary sewer is lower is that there has been a substantial expenditure over that last 10 years on renewal of sewer assets. And so, the renewal need in the next 25-year period is significantly lower than it was in the last 10 years. And so there is some sort of back and forth balancing in this, but the general thing is that we are seeing something in the order of that sort of 50% increase in the renewal need relative to what it was a decade ago or more. Getting into specifics.
Can I just pause you for a second there?
Yes, by all means. Yeah.
Thanks. I see a question in the chat. Is that for us or is that something else? Oh, okay. Never mind. Go ahead.
That was me trying to get in. Yeah.
All right. No problem. So on this table, we kind of get into some details around, first of all, the content that was in that previous chart. And this is a first look at suggested contribution levels going forward, which I'll immediately acknowledge represents an increase in the renewal reserve contribution in total, about 3.35 million. And that needs to be taken, I think, in the context of an increase in IDCA funding and acknowledging that a contribution from NRM's own revenues to match that would take you most of the way to that number. The current funding levels, we've already sort of shown you at 8.55 million. Average funding needs. One thing that's important to mention here is that for the airfield, we are differentiating between assets that we know would be funded by ACAP if they were to be renewed, and assets that we are quite certain will not be funded by ACAP. So funded by ACAP would be the main runway 0422, as well as taxiway A and apron 1. and the lighting and drainage for those assets. There are some minor assets in other categories that would also be funded by ACAP in fleet, for example. But with the airfield pavements and the associated drainage and lighting, we want to make sure that we're not counting those things as sort of a reserve contribution need, because they will be funded externally in order for that service to continue to be provided. So the suggested reserve contribution for assets that would be funded by ACAP is 0. And that's for that precise reason that we would expect that full $1.6 million need to be covered by ACAP. The other thing that you'll notice is that the suggested reserve contribution for non-ACAP airfield assets is about half of what the estimated average need is for the next 25 years or so. And the reason for that is that there are some assets, non-ACAP funded assets, that probably for subsequent discussion would potentially not be renewed. That would include Crosswind Runway 0826 and a portion of Apron 3, which is really larger than it needs to be for operational needs. So those are some considerations. When we look at the forecast that I'm going to show you, the revised forecast at this $11.9 million suggested reserve contribution level, that does include renewal of some of those assets that are not funded at the suggested target reserve contribution level. They may not need to be funded, and that's a decision for this council for the future, as I understand. So yeah, I think maybe I'll pause on this because I think, Scott, you were hoping that we'd have some discussion on this slide.
Well, if any questions that council may have, anyway, I think I spoke to it earlier. I think you summed it up quite well, but Councillor Andrews has a question.
I see you, Councillor Andrews, go ahead.
Thank you. So I like how you mentioned that consideration was given to like the downsizing of an asset, like the aprons, they're too wide, so we won't need to contribute as much. Was that kind of concept taken throughout the whole process? Like, is every one of our fleet need to be replaced? Has there been looking for synergies that way as well?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a great question and an important one. So yes, that has been taken into account, and I would say that for almost all of the asset categories that we're looking at here, consideration has been given to how we can optimize renewal programs based on required levels of service or target levels of service based on risks. So things have been prioritized. We've taken a careful look at over the last dozen years of asset management work. We've taken a look at a number of assets that would be considered potentially surplus to needs. I mean, there are some things that are still on the books that you're probably well aware of. The old aquatic center building that doesn't serve any particular need at this point. Those are all things that we are taking into account in these forecasts. With fleet in particular, there's been sort of an operationalized view of a review of the entire asset inventory that happens every year to look at sort of utilization levels, criticality of the assets, which assets are currently on the books that are surplus to needs, and removing those assets from the books. That's done every year on a routine basis for fleet. So I can safely say that staff, public works staff, have a very good handle on operationally ensuring that renewal reserve request is really refined to meet the core needs of the organization for fleet assets. So there's some examples, but yeah. The other thing that I would say is we are recognizing, so the 11.9 million is less than the 13.8 million. The two reasons for that do relate to the airfield. One, ACAP funds 1.6 million of the difference, and the rest of the difference is taken up in that sort of underfunding of non-ACAP assets, recognizing that it's likely that there will be a decision at some point not to fund renewal of all of those. If all of the airfield assets that are not ACAP funded that do have some current use need to be sustained in the long term, that's a number that would either need to be increased in time, or potentially you would seek, other funding grants or something like that to cover the difference. Grants are an important piece of this. Scott mentioned it already. We don't want to over allocate into these reserve funds and then have, funding from alternate sources cover some of those costs, and then to wind up with more in your reserve funds than you need to sustain assets in the long term. So we're going to err on the low side, if anything, but we don't want to err too far on the low side and then saddle, the future community with the burden of costs for services that have benefited the current community. That's kind of the principle behind all of this.
Okay, Scott?
Yeah, and just to add to your, just some examples for your question, Councillor Andrews. I mean, I spoke about the water treatment plant already. That's a perfect example right there, where we looked at, looking at different efficiencies to increase capacity without capital expenditure specific to expanding the plant. On our fleet side, we'll look at plow trucks that when we look for replacement, they're already past end of life, quite frankly. But again, I mean, we'll joke with the tsunami truck, but the tsunami truck stuck around for a few extra years before it finally was put to rest. So those are things that we defer, and we look at efficiencies when we replace fire apparatuses, the pickup trucks in the fire system, because of the importance that when a duty officer on call, firefighter goes out to respond to the call of duty, it's important that there's a reliability there. Not that it's not important that it doesn't start for public works, but we actually move those to public works because the risk and the consequence isn't the same. If you gotta use a set of booster cables on a cold day, so be it. But we push things to the limit, but we factor in the risk and the consequence. We do the similar thing. We look at the drainage system, right? Depending on the situation, if it's a main artery, we don't want a drainage system or a storm system to fail because of the consequence. If it's a side road, not that we're okay with it failing, but we assume a higher level of risk, quite frankly. But all those things are factored in when we look at how do you stretch the dollar out, for lack of better words.
Thank you. Okay.
Further questions?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. So when we take this suggested target reserve contribution level into account, and Scott had already kind of mentioned this, where we land, again, recognizing that this is a simplistic analysis. We're estimating that reserves would be sufficient to cover costs through at least the next 35, 45 years before the reserve funds are depleted. So we're not at what we would consider to be a fully sustainable funding level, but we are at a level which is approaching sustainable. When we refine these numbers over time, we review them every few years. We're in a place where we can make decisions about whether those contribution levels need to be increased in order to ensure that you're not overly burdening future generations with costs of renewals when some of the really big renewal expenditures come up. And what's happening incidentally in that respect in the sort of 2060s to 2090s is we would see things like water mains that were virtually all replaced in the 1980s, 1990s, becoming due for replacement again. We're seeing some of the main structural components of something like the rec complex needing to be replaced. So that's around the time frame where the sort of the major midlife renewal of the rec complex may be coming due, or of major parts of the rec complex may be coming due. Your sewer assets, which are all relatively new and in good condition at this point, certainly sewer facility assets would be coming due for replacement. So that's a period of time where we can expect that fairly high level of reinvestment in renewal will be needed. And you've got a substantial amount of time at this funding level to plan for that and to consider whether perhaps we've got better technologies for monitoring the condition of underground assets that would enable us to optimize and potentially extend lives of infrastructure. That helps to ensure, that we are adequately funding asset renewals without over contributing to them in the long run. Any questions on this revised projection?
No, I'm not seeing any here.
Okay. Well, we're coming to the finish line then. A couple of important sort of comments on next steps. I think the intent with this today was to open the discussion. There will be further discussion and presentations on individual service areas that delve a little bit more into the details of what this financial forecast looks like and some of those considerations around how we optimize to ensure that the service is sustainable and resilient at the lowest possible or the lowest sustainable cost, I should say, life cycle cost. And then the intent to bring the asset management policy back for some review and updates, which I think has been in discussion for the last little while also. Scott, maybe I'll bounce it back to you. Is there anything else that you'd like to add in terms of next steps?
No, I think you covered it. I mean, one obvious one down the road, I guess, in the future, which myself and Tony was talking about yesterday, is with 8 years left on the IDCA agreement. It's the conversation and the hopeful renegotiation of some sort of agreement past 2034. So that's obviously something that'd be in the works also, and it's something that we did broach with the province when we met them in Victoria end of September during UBCM. But other than that, nothing else. Just any questions council may have. And the intent for today's discussion, frankly, was to have the dialogue and hopefully council's a good understanding of what we're looking at, and the budget process actually has the increase. So when you get the documents, it actually has that increase in there for council as for your review and for hopefully the approval. But also at that time we'll discuss how the what Tony's done in terms of how the contributions work. As I said, it's a bit of a phased approach, and we are utilizing some of the potential what we expect to get on interest this year to help offset a big jump to that level this year from a recommended contribution.
Perfect. Thank you. Are there any questions, council, or comments? Mayor, did I see your hand?
I have one around the last slide with respect to the presentations on the individual service. So will that happen during budget, or when will those discussions happen?
No, Mayor, that's specific. If we were able to slide it in during budgets, it'd be great. I think from a timing and just discussion, it's going to probably be challenging given the timeline. These are more towards, this particular service areas, and really we've delved into the cost to provide specific services in the service areas. It's outside of, it includes what the asset replacement cost would be, but it's also the operational costs. And these are the services and the cost to provide those services, and also potentially linking into fees in certain areas in terms of how do you fund those services. And that gets really into then council strategizing in terms of what are the opportunities and other ways to fund certain services from a operational perspective to help offset those costs. Because typically we look at strictly taxation and the fees that we have in place currently that haven't been changed for years. Right.
So that isn't going to be ready before budget?
Well, we're on the finish line. The challenge is it would be challenging to have it done at the time for budget for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. There's lots of discussion with that one. So when I look at the amount of time that we need for council to get into each individual service area, it's a bit of a process.
Mm-hmm. Councilor Roper?
Let's say when we get to the decision, if council chooses not to increase contributions, we flat out lose that additional revenue from the province, correct?
Not this year, no. But you would need to make it up at some point in time, because if so, because annually we report on the projects and annually report on our contribution versus the province's contribution. So we know, and Tony has a report in the budget this year that outlines the IDCA agreement, what we've contributed, and what the average contribution that we need to provide annually to the end of the agreement to make sure that we meet our commitment. So if we don't contribute a certain amount, when you add up when we say contribution, what we're spending or contributing to reserve funds, if you don't spend it this year, you're making up a difference in future years, essentially, right? Or yes, we never really had the conversation with the province to say what would happen if we didn't do it, because the agreement says
We
we
do
will,
it. Yeah.
right? So I mean, in good faith, it's the proper thing to do. I wouldn't recommend not doing it or meeting it at the end of the term of the agreement
Being sure.
and not expecting the province to say we want our money back. But I really don't know.
But essentially, at the end of the day, the more funds we put into it, the more we get from the province.
To the limit,
Up
yes,
to the
yes. So
And
right.
they've raised the limit is what you're.
Yeah, so originally, if you recall, the first 5 years of the agreement, we were 10, it was 10 million by the province, and we were matching 10. We were able to negotiate funds that we front loaded. So we got ahead of the game. So we argued that the funds that we put into the building of the rec center and some work that was occurred at the airport and terminal building, Apron 2 at the time, because the agreement was in the works, we just hadn't received any funds yet. We said, this is funds that the NRM's put in. So they agreed to that. So we got ahead of the game a little bit, which was good. So we actually have more contributed right now than the province has. I think to the tune of, as of 24, I think 84 million contribution, and the province is 75. The second 5 years, because of the downturn in the economy, the indicators were developed to say, okay, how do we determine what those funds will be to NRM? And they created a $5 million baseline. So for the second 5 years, we had 5 million from the province, which meant our annual matching was 5 million. But in actual fact, a bit less because we front loaded the program a little bit. Last year was, as Colin mentioned, was the third 5 year cycle, which the indicators were reviewed, and one of the indicators is movements at the airport, which added the 3 indicators, so bumped it up 1/3 essentially to the 6.69, which bumps up our contribution essentially. And then we'll see where that, so there's another review after these 5 years to see where it is. So that's the limit. And I think the number that we would need to contribute annually based on is about 5.7. That's in the report, on average. So, and that's if council wants the 50-cent dollars essentially. Yeah.
Okay.
Answer your question? Okay.
Okay. Mayor, did I hear you? No?
No.
Okay. All right. I think that covers all the questions and all the comments. Seeing no more, just checking to see if there's any questions from the public. Seeing none, I guess we can call this meeting adjourned. Thank you very much, Colin, and for staff for, of course, all your work as always, and presenting it in a way that is so understandable and relatable. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. And we're adjourned.
Yes.